Chapter 3, Educated and Underemployed, The Rise of Lumpenintelligentsia. Spring 1991. In a bare one-room apartment without running water on the outskirts of Cairo, an American visitor inquired about a framed document hung on the wall. The young, unemployed father of 4 took down the frame and wiped off the dust with a corner of his torn galabeah. "This," he said, "is my university diploma." Nasser's system of free higher education and guaranteed state employment not only survived under his successors, but expanded to cover a growing circle of beneficiaries. By the early 1980s, however, the country's output of university graduates exceeded the state sector's capacity to absorb them, forcing an increasing number of graduates to accept jobs they considered beneath their station and to join the ranks of the underemployed or the unemployed. Paradoxically, a system of populist entitlements designed to reinforce the political loyalty of educated youth ultimately increased their expectations beyond the regime's capacity to deliver. It thus inadvertently produced an enormous reservoir of discontent in the more permissive political environment of 1980s and early 1990s. It thus inadvertently produced an enormous reservoir of discontent that, in the more permissive political environment of the 1980s and early 1990s, could be exploited by the regime's opponents. The educated middle strata, class or status group. Before tracing the erosion of graduates' employment and earning prospects, let us clarify the nature of the group in question. Translating directly from Arabic, al-muta'alamin or al-muthaqafin, the educated or cultured ones, are technically not a class but a status group, defined not by occupation, income, or relation to the means of production, but by possession of a shahada, or formal educational degree. The possession of higher degrees in Egypt was historically associated with white-collar employment, and given the small size of the Egyptian private sector, primarily with technical, professional, and administrative positions in the state. Indeed, at the height of the Nasser era, the absorption of nearly all graduates into the state apparatus made the association between higher education and state employment virtually complete. Hence, scholars referred to the educated strata as the new middle class, a stratum characterized by modern white-collar employment and a corresponding middle-class income and lifestyle. Beginning in the mid-1970s, however, the tight link between higher education and public employment in Egypt began to loosen. No longer able to absorb all eligible youth immediately, the government gradually lengthened the time between graduation and appointment until it approached 10 years. As the prospects of immediate state employment waned, more and more graduates resorted to manual work in the informal sector, for example, mechanics, carpet installers, house painters, plumbers, and taxi drivers, or remained unemployed. Hence, within a decade, a status group that had once corresponded to a distinct social class had come to assume a pyramidal structure with older, established professionals at its apex and a large pool of young, economically marginalized graduates at its base. As later chapters show, it was the young, declassed members of this status group, the Lumpenintelligentsia, or simply the Lumpen elite, who became the Islamist movement's main base of support. This chapter recounts how the overexpansion of subsequent exhaustion of the Egyptian state system of populist entitlements helped create an aggrieved constituency available for mobilization by Islamic groups. To begin, let us trace the overexpansion of the system during the resource boom of the late 1970s and the early 1980s. The overextension of the Egyptian patron state, 1974 to 1983. In economic terms, the decade following the October War of 1973 in Egypt is best characterized as the era of the resource boom, with growth fueled by windfall revenues from sources outside the domestic economy's productive sectors. This resource boom was made possible by the Infitah, Egypt's open-door economic policy. Initiated by President Sadat in the mid-1970s, the Infitah entailed a series of legislative measures to attract foreign investment, stimulate the Egyptian private sector, and liberalize foreign trade. The partial relaxation of state control over transnational flows of labor, capital, and goods facilitated the economy's growing extroversion. The Egyptian economy grew at an impressive average rate of 9.1% per year, with the main contributions coming from four exogenous sources: oil revenues, workers' remittances, Suez Canal receipts, and tourism. Despite the rhetoric emanating from high circles about improving government productivity, efficiency, and discipline, both Sadat and Mubarak channeled a large share of these windfall profits into the system of populist entitlements they inherited from Nasser. Even during the boom times of the Infitah era, state spending grew at a faster rate than revenues, generating chronic budget deficits that were financed through foreign debt. First, public employment continued to expand. Between 1977 and 1981, at the height of the country's purported economic liberalization, employment in the state sector grew by an average of 6.3% per year, while the labor force grew by an average of 2.8% per year. Moreover, the state sector, that is, government administration, and the public industry sector combined, remained the country's largest source of new jobs. Ragi Assad estimates that between 1977 and 1984, the state generated 55.3% of all new employment for Egyptians, including jobs abroad, or 70.7% of all new employment inside the country. According to the CAPMA's population census of 1986, the Egyptian state employed 3.78 million people, representing nearly one-third of the total employment and more than half of all employment outside agriculture. The resource boom also financed a dramatic expansion of Egypt's system of higher education. In a bid for popular support, Sadat opened the country's national universities to an unprecedented number of students and extended the system into the provinces. Between 1974 and 1978, 7 new provincial universities, Tanta, Mansoura, Zagazig, Helwan, Minya, Menofia, and the Suez, to the existing 4, Cairo, Alexandria, Ain Shams, and Aisut, plus Al-Azhar, as well as several new four-year higher technical institutes and regional branches of established faculties. In addition to expanding the system's infrastructure, Sadat increased the proportion of students admitted to the university from roughly 40% of those who took the baccalaureate exam in the early 1970s to more than 60% in the late 1970s and 1980s. This expansion broadened access and fueled aspirations to higher education among students further down the social ladder, including thousands of students from the lower class neighborhoods of Egypt's provincial cities and towns. In just a decade, the country's annual output of university graduates nearly tripled, rising from 41,916 in 1975 to 115,744 in 1985. The rapid expansion of Egypt's graduate pool placed a heavy burden on the government's guaranteed employment scheme. By the 1970s, the scheme covered all graduates with secondary school intermediate, 2-year technical institute advanced intermediate, and 4-year university or higher degrees. Available data indicate that in the late 1970s, slightly fewer than half of all university graduates and more than half of all intermediate degree holders sought public employment. Graduates covered by the Guaranteed Employment Scheme received priority over other prospective employees in the state's hiring decisions. Indeed, by one estimate, they obtained roughly half of all new jobs created by the state from 1977 to 1981, even though in 1976 they constituted just 14% of the employed labor force. Maintenance of the guaranteed employment policy was predictably expensive. First, there was the literal cost, as indicated by the swelling government wage bill, which in nominal terms doubled every 3.6 years, thus growing at an annual compound rate of 22.8%. Second was the less tangible but no less real cost to bureaucratic performance posed by severe overstaffing. Already by the late 1970s, hidden unemployment in the state sector was estimated to be between 15 and 50%. Moreover, as indicated by the average three-year time period between graduation and appointment, there was a substantial backlog of graduates awaiting government jobs even before the onset of fiscal crisis in the early 1980s. Perhaps most ominously, the steady growth in new graduate appointments reduced public salaries at a time when wages and other public Perhaps most ominously, the steady growth in new graduate appointments reduced public salaries at a time when wages in other sectors of the economy were rising. From 1974 to 1984, average annual GDP growth rates of 9% permitted per capita incomes to double. From 1974 to 1984, average annual GDP growth rates of 9% permitted per capita incomes to double from $334 to $700. Now earning opportunities opened up in the highly lucrative fields of petroleum, banking, construction, and trade. At the same time, the construction boom increased the demand for various categories of skilled and unskilled labor, both within Egypt and in the oil-rich states of the Persian Gulf. The massive outflow of unskilled rural laborers into the construction sector created labor shortages in the countryside, leading to the tripling of real wages in agriculture between 1973 and 1984. As wages rose throughout the private economy between 1974 and 1984 in the public sector, the real wages of white-collar workers dropped by 8%, and those in government administration fell by 23%. The era of the resource boom coincided with the decline in the incomes of degree holders relative to those of other groups in Egyptian society, as well as with the emergence of new lines of stratification within the educated middle class itself. The grievances of degree holders only intensified in the 1980s when, in the midst of a fiscal crisis, the Egyptian state attempted to scale back the system of entitlements that had ballooned so large over the preceding decade. The exhaustion of the Egyptian patron state, 1983 to 1991. Beginning around 1981, the collapse of world oil prices led to prolonged economic recession in Egypt and other oil exporting states, with exogenous revenues accounting for 3/4 of the Egyptian state's current account receipts and more than 40% of GDP. The Egyptian economy was particularly vulnerable to external shocks. Annual growth in GDP fell from an average of 9% in the decade between 1974 and 1984 to roughly 2.6% from 1986 to 1988. And beginning in 1986, per capita consumption growth turned negative. To address the twin gaps between investment and savings and between imports and exports, the Mubarak regime increased its borrowing abroad. By 1988, aggregate debt exceeded 115% of GDP, with debt service amounting to more than 60% of exports. In addition, the regime accelerated its use of deficit financing, contributing to inflation, which was conservatively estimated at 15 to 25% per year. Facing mounting pressure from external donors to reduce the government's budget deficit, the regime cut back public spending from 63% of GDP in 1982 to 41.4% of GDP in 1989. Despite the growing budgetary constraints, the Mubarak regime continued to channel a large share of available funds into the social contract. Fearing a repeat of the 1977 bread riots, the regime kept consumer subsidies at a high level, roughly 20% of GDP if implicit subsidies are included, through the 1980s. After the informal sector, the state was also the largest source of new domestic employment. In his 1989 May Day speech, President Mubarak claimed that the number of jobs created by the state since 1982 had reached 1.2 million, or 170 jobs each year. He explained, this is because the private sector alone cannot provide enough jobs for all people who enter the labor market every year. Despite the pressures for budgetary reform, state employment continued to expand, rising from 3.78 million in 1986 to 4.62 million in 1991. Graduates covered by the Guaranteed Employment Scheme took most of the new state jobs. Indeed, according to one estimate, in the early 1980s, they received more than 90% of new jobs in the state sector. The diversion of public resources from growth to services and to the government's the diversion of public resources from growth and services to the government's mushrooming wage bill indicates the priority the Mubarak regime placed on the absorption of new graduates. Above all, this priority reflected the regime's concern about the political risks of massive educated unemployment. The phenomenon of educated unemployment. Owing to the rapid expansion of Egypt's education system, a growing share of roughly 400,000 to 500,000 workers entering the Egyptian labor market had intermediate and university degrees. Egypt's labor force grew by about 2.2% per year from 1976 to 1986, whereas the supply of graduates grew by 7.4% per year. Hence, just as the Egyptian economy was entering a period of recession, there was an enormous influx of new graduates seeking work. Classified reports circulating in various government ministries revealed some alarming trends. In 1987, an internal study by the Ministry of Labor warned that only 29.8% of new university and intermediate level graduates were being directly absorbed by the domestic labor market. A parallel study by the Cabinet Information and Decision Support Center in 1991 indicated that the domestic labor market was employing only 25% of new university and intermediate level graduates, but that it was hiring 90% of those who were illiterate, and in the next to last educational category of can read and write. Open unemployment among graduates was reflected in the lengthening queue of government jobs. Unwilling to abandon the Guaranteed Employment Scheme, yet unable to hire graduates right away, the government simply extended the waiting period between graduation and employment. For university graduates, the waiting period between graduation and appointment increased from 3 years for the class of 1979 to 9 years to 9 to 10 years for the class of 1985. With the waiting period for intermediate graduates an average of 1 year with the waiting period of intermediate graduates an average of 1 year longer than that of university graduates. Simultaneous with the slowdown in the graduate appointments, the safety valve provided by outmigration came under strain. Through the early 1980s, the economies of the oil-rich Gulf states were an important outlet for Egyptian labor. According to the government's Egyptian Immigration Survey, 1.2 million Egyptians were working abroad in the mid-1980s. Although 56% of Egyptian migrant workers had little education, 13% had university degrees. Moreover, a study in 1990 at a CAPMA-sponsored conference on Egyptian migration reported that a quarter of university students were working abroad in 1986. Then, falling oil prices led to an economic slowdown in the Gulf, depressing the demand for Egyptian workers. Finally, political disturbances in the late 1980s and early 1990s triggered a massive wave of return migration from the Gulf, including an estimated 390,000 workers from Iraq and Kuwait as a result of the Gulf War. The introduction of an unprecedented number of graduates into the Egyptian labor market during a period of regional economic contraction led to a sharp rise in educated underemployment. Official census figures indicate that the rate of unemployment in Egypt rose from 2.2% in 1969 to 7.7% in 1976 to 12% in 1986. They also revealed that open unemployment was primarily among those with intermediate and university degrees entering the labor market for the first time. According to the population of 1986, more than 3/4, 76.4% of the unemployed were new entrants to the labor force, and within this group, 91% had at least an intermediate level degree. Thus, even though degree holders, intermediate level and above, accounted for only about 1/3, 32% of the total labor force in 1985, they made up 3/4, or 74% of the unemployed. According to the 1986 census, the unemployment rate for intermediate degree holders was 28.8%, and for university graduates, around 25.5%. Educated employment remained a serious problem into the 1990s. According to the 1991 CAPMA's Labor Force Sample Survey, 1.46 million Egyptians were unemployed, of whom 78% held at least an intermediate degree. It is possible that the official figures grossly underestimated real unemployment. In 1991, U.S. Embassy officials estimated total unemployment in Egypt to be about 2.5 million to 3 million, nearly double the official government estimate. The problem of educated unemployment in public debate. Beginning around 1988, the problem of unemployment and educated unemployment in particular became the subject of intense public debate. For the first time, the once sacrosanct legacy of free higher education and guaranteed employment came under attack, not only by academics and opposition figures, but most strikingly, also by leaders in the state itself. It is difficult to determine who first brought the issue of educated unemployment to the public eye, but officials of the Engineers Association claim that distinction. We at the Engineers Association were the first to utter the word unemployment in 1988. At the same time, the government was still trying to hide the information, as it was afraid. In late December of that year, the association, then under Islamist leadership, sponsored a public forum, Unemployment Among Engineers. Association officials claimed that the 15 research papers present at the forum represented the first objective study of unemployment among professionals. Most often cited was the finding that about 30,000 engineers were currently unemployed, most of whom were under the age of 35. Another candid discussion of educated unemployment appeared in Al-Ahram al-Iqtisadi, Economic Al-Ahram editorial in October 1988. In a poignant appeal, the editor-in-chief, Issam Rafat, departed from the technical economic commentary for which the journal is known. As the problems accumulate, I received dozens of letters from the university graduates asking me to help them get a job. In fact, although I try to welcome whatever I receive by way of letters and care greatly about what is written in them, I now stand helpless in the face of this phenomenon, and I suffer as I cannot help anyone. It was not until 1989, however, that the problem of educated unemployment, and by implication, the broader system of state entitlements to which it was linked, became a major focal point of public debate. In addition to several academic conferences on the subject, the issue of unemployment was raised in Parliament, in the annual conference of the ruling National Democratic Party, in President Mubarak's annual May Day speech. It was also the focus of numerous articles in both the official and the opposition press. Once the issue of educated unemployment became a subject of public debate, the Mubarak regime attempted to use the discussion for its own purposes, seeking ways to extricate itself from populist commitments inherited from the Nasserist path. At conferences on television and in the press, regime spokesmen warned graduates and their families that they must shed unrealistic expectations and learn to accept manual and vocational work. As the Minister of Planning, Kamal El-Ganzouri, stressed at the annual NDP conference in 1989, in the coming period, the issue of unemployment will be an issue of the people as a whole, and its solution will be in their hands, and not in the hands of the government alone. This viewpoint was the dominant, but by no means the only message contained in the state's rhetoric. Some government officials also wanted to defend the revolutionary gains of the Nasser era. This perspective was most closely associated with socialist-leaning politicians and state establishment, the most visible being Rafat al-Mahgoub, Speaker of the People's Assembly, although its sympathizers included influential senior bureaucrats and to some degree the president himself. Their warning cautioned against a retreat from populist entitlements, partly on ideological grounds and partly on the grounds that such a move was likely to provoke a massive protest. At the annual NDP conference in July of 1989, Rafat al-Mahgoub confirmed that in the future, the private sector must help create jobs, but he insisted reform of the current system could take place only on condition that it did not violate the right of the citizen to work. He concluded with the promise that the employment of graduates in free education and the subsidy system will remain despite all the difficulties. Perhaps most revealing of the conflicting forces shaping the regime's policy was the tentative position staked out by President Mubarak himself. He repeatedly expressed his commitment to an economic reform program which, he admitted, would bring hardship in the short term. At the same time, however, the president portrayed himself as standing up to the International Monetary Fund in order to protect the Egyptian people. For example, in his 1990 May Day speech, Mubarak referred to the IMF as the Fund of Misery and asserted that the country's economy can only be reformed gradually. In a televised speech at Alexandria University in July 1992, the president again challenged both the pace and content of proposed reforms. When we started the 5-year plan in 1982, many economists told me during our meetings, "Mr. President, the situation requires a courageous step." What sort of courageous step, they said. Cancel subsidies, cancel free education, lay off 25% of government employees. Oh no. Reduce the army, they said. The Egyptian army supports every citizen. It backs the Egyptian people. Who makes up the army but our own sons? If you reduce the army, what would you really be doing? You would be dismissing your own sons. People have sons and brothers in the army. These sons would have nothing to do outside the army and would become unemployed. What would you do then? In sum, the president tried to have it both ways, taking credit for undertaking urgently needed economic reforms on the one hand, while claiming to defend the Egyptian people against such reforms on the other. By the mid-1980s, there was a growing awareness, both inside and outside the Egyptian government, that a large pool of graduates had emerged that the modern sector of the economy could not absorb, that the government allowed the problem of the educated unemployment to gain such visibility, and indeed acknowledged it so starkly, reveals the urgency of its search for a solution.